Hello and welcome to the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything fantasy and science fiction. Your host is Matt Crosswhite, and the subject matter expert is Josiah Marshall. And here we go.
Welcome to another episode of the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. I am your host, Matt Crosswhite, joined by subject matter expert who is trying to take a drink of his tea while laughing and not able to actually take said drink, Josiah Marshall. How are you today, sir?
Doing well. I'm doing well, man. You do that to me so often. I should know better.
Whatever do you mean? Do what to you? Make you laugh right before we start the episode? No.
Oh, no. No, I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for asking. We're enjoying some very wintry weather up here, and we're getting some more of it soon. So thankfully, things are good on our precipitation front.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
How about you? How's Arizona these days?
We are doing well. Much less snow than you have. And we had a little bit of rain last night, but no big deal.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds
We had
pretty
snow
good.
a week and a half ago, but yeah, we're good to go.
All right. Sounds good. Done any good reading lately?
I've actually done very little reading recently. Life has been a bit busy, so our family's a little bit in transition, so we haven't had a whole ton of time. Although I have started, the name just completely escaped me. I started 2 novels, one of which is Ready Player One.
Yep.
The 5th season by N.K. Jemisin.
Mm-hmm. Those
Both
are good.
of which are very good, but
Yep,
I have
those
not
are good.
haven't had a ton of time to dig into them.
Okay. All right. Well, at least you're able to jump into something. I know that these days it can be very busy for folks, but those are some good books to start reading on. Especially, have you seen? So when you see the movie of Ready Player One, let me know. I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Sure. It's a far less complicated, not that the 5th season is complicated, but it's N.K. Jemisin seems to be a very intelligent writer, and Ready Player One is just a more simple narrative. So it depends on my mental acuity level when I go to sit down and pick up a book. Do I want something that'll be interesting and exciting, or do I want something to just chill and relax?
Yeah. Yeah. And Ready Player One does that, especially with nostalgia. It's very nostalgic.
Yes.
It's built heavily off of the 80s and, well, really 70s, 80s, and 90s pop culture. And it's got a lot of really cool references and Easter eggs. But as fun as that book is, I've got another one in mind to talk about today, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
We're gonna talk about Watership Down. You ever heard of it?
Down. I have not.
Well,
Watership. Why refer to it as a watership is my first question. Like to be contrasted with a spaceship?
That is an excellent question. Because the author did not title the book at all. It was the publishing house that titled the book, and they didn't really give a reason that I know of. There could be one out there, but that I know of, there's no reason as to why they called it Watership Down, except that downs are it's a very common name for grassy areas and grassy knolls in England. So this entire story, it takes place in what's known as Hampshire. So we have New Hampshire here in the United States in the New England area, but there's an original Hampshire in southern England. Yeah. And so this entire story takes place in this Hampshire area, at least Hampshire-esque area. Still definitely some uh, 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 fantasy elements to it, of course. But
Oh, sure.
but it was written by a guy named Richard Adams back in 1972 is when it was published. And now my daughter really liked this book, and even the subsequent cartoon movie. I'll mention that in a little bit, but she's really big into rabbits, and that's what this story's about: rabbits, and more rabbits. It's quite something what this guy did. He had a heavy focus on rabbits, but I like how the story originated, actually, because it's one of those fun ways of being able to introduce your kids to stories, because he would start telling these stories off the top of his head when he would be driving down the road with his kids, with his two daughters, to be precise. And I've done that myself a few times, even to the point where there's this little creative process that you can do where you've got this imaginary box and you're pulling at least three things out of it: a thing, an animal, and an action. And so you make up a story off the top of your head just on those three things. And but he started these with his kids, and his kids loved him so much. They said, "Daddy, you've got to write this down. You've got to write it down." And so he thought, you know what? I guess I might as well. So he sat down in the evenings and had this thing written in 18 months, which is roughly what you would expect for a book to be written. G.R.R. Martin would, I think, like to set a new marathon record for that, considering how long he writes books. And also Rothfuss, he can take his jolly time in getting a book out to the chagrin of his readers. But no, Richard Adams got this thing out in 18 months. Nobody was actually expecting it, but he got this thing out. And the bummer thing is, especially back in the 1970s and really 1970s and earlier, a lot of people, especially publishing houses, wasn't so sure about this sort of stuff, including another author that comes to mind is Beatrix Potter.
Okay.
She the funny thing is that the true story, as we even see in the movie for Beatrix Potter, a younger partner went to meet with her who didn't really have a lot of experience in publishing, and he thought her stories were so endearing he said yes, whereas his other publishers would have said no, because flights of fancy and imagination were not very common back in those days. That is, back in Beatrix Potter's days. But by 1970, things had warmed up a bit, especially after the success of Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia to some degree. But even then, there was still a very general populist reaction to some of these. And that was, okay, it's great for kids, but we need something more practical and pragmatic and literal for adults. But it was still one of those books that he went through several different publishers before he found one publisher, and it was a one-man publishing group. He couldn't even pay Adams in advance.
Oh, wow.
So what he did was that he was able to print out the book and get enough copies to get it on the right desks in England, so that it got into the proper hands, and then being able to get out from there. This guy knew how to operate the system, the publishing world system in England. But he got the book published, and as I said, his author, his publishing house actually named the book. And it went on to actually win awards. Which every now and then, when I hear the story of other publishing houses dropping a book, you go, I wonder if they're hitting themselves now or kicking themselves now, because this book went on to actually garner some worldwide success. Because not only did it win the Carnegie Medal, it also won the Guardian Medal and actually many other book awards. It ended up getting adapted in several different ways. And even that, Adams wrote a sequel to it 25 years later in 1996, known as Tales from Watership Down. and it was just a collection of short stories, but it was still enough to realize, no, this story is timeless. It's classic, and it's definitely got some sustaining power. And when I say classic too, there are definitely motifs that you can draw from older, more allegorical themes that you see, such as out of Homer or Virgil, or some of these epic motifs where it looks at heroes and looks at what if this happened. What more so, it really looks at the struggles that you find between tyranny and freedom, and reason and blind emotion, and really even more so the individual and the corporate state. So it really tackled some really big themes, but at the same time, it did get some criticism. One main criticism was gender roles. There's a part in the book where he makes a point that this rabbit named Fiver has a vision and sees that the Warren, a collection of rabbits, is going to be destroyed. And so he tries to convince the Warren of this coming doom. And the only people that would believe him were bucks, male rabbits. So they leave, and they have a very interesting journey. And so, but by the time they get to Watership Down, which now that I recall was really, as I mentioned earlier, the name of a lot of hills and knolls and grassy areas. So I'm thinking that I tend to think that the publisher had this in mind when he's picturing this coming out of the book. But they get there after a harrowing journey to realize, wait a minute, our Warren, our colony is not going to be able to sustain itself because we're all bucks. We don't have any females. We don't have any does.
Whoops.
But they had an adventure at a farm and the farmer had a collection of does and a couple of bucks end up. And so they went back to the farm to free them, just so that the Warren would survive. And so the criticism was, it sounds like the does are more of an afterthought. They're not as important, only for the sustaining of themselves. And so that got him some criticism, especially in later days, just because of the idea of sexes, equality among the sexes, especially in the 90s and into the 2000s. But he's still been appreciated for creating something that even one person said was on the same intellectual power as Dumbo. Now, you almost get a hint of, again, sarcasm in there, because even that critic even used the words pleasant enough. So you still get some sarcasm going on here among some of these more critical book reviewers. But nonetheless, it created a wonderful journey that was indelible to so many stories, to kids especially. And one reviewer even is quoted as saying, if the children's, how did he put it? If the children's section of the library does not have a place for this book, then children's literature is dead. I think is how he phrased it. And it was It was kind of intense, but you know what? So as if with any good story, it's got its good and its bad. It's got its pros and its cons. And so as a result, it creates that tension that you want out of a good story. Yes. Whereas something more basic isn't going to really draw that, and it's not going to get as much acclaim. I found in my past experience that with any book, the more critical acclaim it gets, the likelihood of it getting more readership, because more people are talking about it, even if it's in the negative. You go on to say Rotten Tomatoes, and you see this happen. You see this, it's got a Rotten Tomato of 0, but then the popular vote, or very low, I should say, but the popular vote is off the charts. People like what they like. Right. And so the critical reviewers definitely have their say. They definitely have their position, and they definitely have their place in being able to see the success of something, even when they hate it so much, everybody else loves it. So that is exactly what Watership Down became. And I think it continues to do that, but in ways that I think even Beatrix Potter wasn't able to do. Because what he did was he actually creates a civilization among these rabbits to where they even have so let me back that up to say there's anthropomorphism is heavy in this book. And so anthropomorphism is where, for some who may not understand that word, is where you take say a rabbit and you make them look like, make them sound like, make them behave in ways that are human. So you're anthropomorphizing them to have a culture, a religion, poetry, stories, a language, and mythology, all their own. And it's seen throughout the book. You've got some of them quoting poetry. You've even got this idea of a creation story, which I'd like to think that, and this is just me postulating, but I'd like to think that Richard Adams got that idea from Tolkien. But I do know that during European, some of the European folklore, that it was kind of common to come up with creation stories, even when they were still heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian themes and theology. Because there is some of that similarity and allegory that's going on in that story, especially within the mythology. But he really created something that was complex in its construction and even intense. There are some very dark moments in this story, to the point where I'd even suggest that anyone under 8 might find it a bit too much. But
okay,
that's the original book. Now let's get into adaptations for a second, because now adaptations of this book have made it a little more easier for younger audiences to be able to appreciate it. Because even my own daughter, when I showed her the 1978 cartoon, she enjoyed it. But even she said there were some very dark scenes in it that didn't really scare her, but she goes, that would have bothered me a while ago. She said, it's like, okay, that's fair to know. But there was the cartoon movie. There was even an album of music that was put out that was very similar to the album that was put out for Lord of the Rings by a guy named Bo Hansen. So he put out a music album of it, and then also during the movie, they had a song called Bright Eyes, and that was written and sung by Art Garfunkel.
Really?
Yeah. So there has been some interesting and pretty good music that's definitely been developed for this.
How interesting.
And if I may not have been written by him, but it was definitely sung by Art Garfunkel. But needless to say, that movie really got some good acclaim. My son got excited when he was passing through the room and the narrator voice comes on. He goes, "That's the same guy that did the narration on the Hobbit cartoon." I said, "Yes, it is." So John Hurt got
That's terrific that he recognized it.
Yeah. So John Hurt definitely got some work out of his narration voice in those days, and he did a pretty good job as far as I was concerned. But even the cartoon won an award for, I think it was a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. But it did end up on TV. It was a television show from 1999 to 2001. And it did not air in the United States, though. It was a British television show. And what was it? Three series, but only 2 of them aired in the UK, while the third one and all 3 of them aired in Canada. But it eventually died down, but at least they got 39 episodes out for all those seasons. And even John Hurt came back to do more voice work for the TV show, including Stephen Fry, which I'm sure people have heard of. He even did the audiobook series of Harry Potter. Stephen Fry did. So, but even the show actually it was nominated for an award, Gemini Award, for the best original music score for dramatic series. But it did come back up in interest in 2014, and it was picked up by BBC and Netflix, and they did 4 1-hour episodes.
Really?
And it premiered in December of 2018. And one of my favorite voice actors was hired to do the lead voice. Now, the lead character's name is Hazel or Hazelra, and James McAvoy was hired to play Hazel.
No way.
Yep. So I really enjoyed James. He's got a certain charisma. He's got a certain ability with his voice to really draw you in and almost make you feel welcome in an interesting way. He's not overpowering, and so he's got a good way of doing it. And I couldn't appreciate his skill more. But so you can still see that on Netflix.
Okay.
And then it was also picked up for a theater play, both in 2006 and then also in 2011. So they did a couple of plays on it. And even the Times were reported as saying that they called it an exciting but often brutal tale of survival. Even when it's a muddle, it's a glorious one. So I can see what they mean, because there is definitely some areas where you just feel like everything's feeling very almost oppressive in a way, and it can definitely muddle the senses, especially. But I have not seen the theatrical productions, but I would assume they were pretty good. But there was even a role-playing game of the of the story. Yeah. And it was actually the first game to have non-humanoid roles. And it was back in 1976. And then they published the second edition, I think, in 1982. And there's even some stuff done in 1992 when it was republished. But one of my favorite adaptations was a radio dramatization.
Of course.
Let's see. In 2002, there was a 2-part done, and that was, of course, by BBC Radio. But it was another 2-part, 2-hour dramatization done in 2016, written by the original radio drama man himself, Brian Sibley. So there's 2 options out there to be able to enjoy that on. Now, that's not to say there's not audiobooks. There are audio books. And there's a total of 6 or 7 audio books out there. And
wow.
So yeah, you've got your pick, to say the least. You've even got one of them that was narrated by Peter Capaldi.
No way. Doctor Who.
Doctor Who. Doctor Who's in the house. And so so he did that in 2019 with Black and Stone Audio, and it's a 17-hour, 31-minute audiobook. So it's a big one. There are some abridged versions, such that Andrew Sachs recorded for Puffin Audiobook, so that's available. But the most extensive one was actually that I know of was Peter Capaldi's for 17 hours, 17 and a half hours. So it's like, darn. One of the neater adaptations, though, and this is the last one, was a graphic novel that came out last year.
No way.
Yep. I got it from my daughter, and it's sizable. It's got about 2 inches thick, and she read it twice. It's got, I think, well over 100 pages in it, and she read that whole thing twice on one road trip. So how ironic that the author comes up with the story on road trips with his daughters, and my daughter reads it on a road trip that she and I took. So
how fun.
It was definitely an interesting irony, but yeah. So if there's people out there who's wanting to find a fun little, well, I wouldn't even say fun. It was definitely interesting, has some fun elements, but it's definitely a deep, complex story. It's Watership Down by Richard Adams.
Excellent.
So,
and you've already reviewed all the many different ways that people can access it.
Yes. There's a lot of books out there, and yes, I'll go ahead and mention it is digital. You can get it in a digital format.
So Kindle and stuff like that. Yep. Excellent. So with that, we'll go ahead and close this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, keep reading and keep listening.